Officer Mason Clark already had the lane under control before Victoria Taylor reached the cones. The portable sign said checkpoint. Blue light slid across the hood of her old sedan. 3 cars ahead of her got through fast. A 4th was sent off to the side. By the time she rolled her window down, the pattern was there in plain view. The left lane kept moving. The right lane held people in place. Mason came up with a flashlight in one hand and the other resting near his belt. License and registration. Victoria reached for the glove box. The papers were there, but mixed in with a grocery receipt and an old fuel slip. She pulled the wrong paper first. Set it back. Found the registration under it. One sheet slipped from her fingers and dropped into the door pocket. She missed it once. Got it on the second try. Mason stood there and watched her work through it. When she handed everything over, he went straight to the license. The beam stopped on the address line. Westfield Heights. His eyes stayed there a beat longer than they had on her name. The flashlight moved once across the back seat. Then he pressed his shoulder mic. Westfield car. Send to secondary. He said it like it was routine. Victoria kept both hands on the wheel. Is there a problem with my license? Officer. Mason glanced down again. Pull forward to the right. Shut it off when you stop. Victoria let the car roll ahead and followed the cones into the side lane. The sedan came to a stop under a portable floodlight beside a black sport utility vehicle with its rear hatch open. The last band of sunset still hung over the trees. Down at the checkpoint. Everything already looked white and hard under the lamps. A few drivers in the main line turned to look. Most did what people do. They kept going. One woman in a minivan slowed just enough to get noticed. An officer farther up the lane waved her through with a sharp motion. Victoria turned the key and killed the engine. The fan cut off. The inside of the car went still. Outside, radios kept cracking in short bursts. Captain Grant Mercer stepped away from the command truck. He wore captain bars and carried himself like the whole roadside setup answered to him. Mason handed him the license. Mercer looked at the address first. Only after that did he lift his eyes to Victoria. Step out of the vehicle. Victoria turned toward him. Why am I in secondary? Step out. My license is valid. Mercer rested his hand on the holster. We're doing enhanced screening tonight. The phrase landed flat. Clean enough to say out loud. Loose enough to mean almost anything. Victoria opened the door and stepped out carefully. The shoulder dropped at the edge of the pavement. Her heel caught for half a second on the seam. She steadied herself on the doorframe before standing straight. Mason moved toward the rear quarter panel. Another officer drifted toward the trunk area. Mercer stayed in front of her. Victoria looked from one man to the next, then back to Mercer. What is enhanced screening based on? He let the question sit. Instead, he gave her a new one. Do you consent to a vehicle search? No. She said it once. Nothing extra on it. From the main lane, a white pickup passed through after a quick look and a wave. A silver crossover followed right behind it. Neither one got redirected. Victoria stood beside her car with one hand open at her side and the other clear of the door. Mercer watched her face. Keep your hands where I can see them. She already was. 2 cars back. A phone screen lit up behind a windshield. Somebody had started recording. Mercer caught it right away. He turned his head and called to an officer down the line. Move traffic. No delays. The line picked up speed after that. Cars started rolling through closer together. One phone dropped out of sight. Another driver looked down fast and put both hands back on the wheel. Mason glanced at the license in Mercer's hand, then at Victoria, then back at the address. The floodlight gave off a low hum. Radio traffic kept snapping across the lane. Her engine was off. Her papers were still in their hands. The checkpoint continued around her as if her car had been pulled out of the regular flow and set in its own separate pocket of road. Mercer stayed planted. Mason held his position near the rear of the sedan. The third officer waited by the trunk. Victoria watched Mercer keep his thumb across the address line, while the rest of the lane cleared out, one car at a time. Victoria stayed beside the sedan with her hands visible. Captain Mercer kept the license in one hand. His thumb still covered the address line. Mason Clark came off the rear quarter panel and stopped closer than he had before. The third officer stayed near the trunk. Traffic kept moving in the main lane. The side lane did not. Victoria looked at Mercer. If you're ordering a search, I want the basis for it on record. Mercer shifted the license to his other hand. You're already making this harder than it needs to be. That is not an answer. Mercer turned his head toward Mason. Search request denied by driver. Mark that. Mason spoke into his mic. He repeated Mercer's wording. Victoria heard it from where she stood. Am I being detained? She asked. Mercer looked at her. You're in secondary screening. For what reason? We'll get there. Mason moved toward the driver door. Victoria turned her head. I do not consent to a search. Mercer answered before Mason touched the handle. Then keep talking. See where that gets you. A phone lifted again in the main line. This time the screen stayed up longer. The driver had the angle on the side lane. Mercer saw it. He pointed with 2 fingers. Move that car. An officer farther back stepped into the lane and pushed traffic through faster. The phone dropped when the car rolled ahead. Victoria looked back at Mercer. I'm asking for a supervisor. I am the supervisor. Then I want your name and badge number stated clearly. Mercer kept the license in his hand. Mason opened the driver door. He leaned in halfway and looked across the front seat, then the back seat, then under the steering column. His movements were quick. Victoria kept her feet planted. Her shoulders stayed square to Mercer. Officer Clark just entered my vehicle after I declined consent. Mercer gave her a short look. You want to narrate this all night. I want the record clean. Mason backed out of the car. Nothing in plain view. He held out the registration. Mercer took it, looked at it once, then handed it back. Victoria watched him do it. Mercer stepped closer. You from Westfield think every stop is a courtroom. Victoria answered in the same tone she had used from the start. I live at the address on the card you're holding. The line in the main lane shortened. A dark sedan pulled through with a quick check and kept moving. Mercer stayed with Victoria. Put your hands on the hood. What is the charge? Hands on the hood. Victoria stayed where she was. I am complying with lawful instructions. I need the reason stated. Mason reached for her arm. He took it above the elbow and turned her toward the hood. Victoria did not pull away. I am not resisting. Mercer stepped in on the other side. The third officer closed the distance from the trunk. When Mason first came to her window, the light on his body camera had been on. Victoria looked at his chest now. The light was dark. Your camera is off, she said. Mason kept hold of her arm. Mercer spoke over her. Detain her. That changed the stop. Mason drew her wrists behind her back. The third officer reached into the front seat and took her phone. Her keys came next. Then her wallet. Each item went into a clear property bag. Victoria turned her head enough to keep her words clear. I want an attorney. Mercer spoke to the third officer. Tag the property. Mason checked her jacket fast. Outer pockets first. Then the waistband. Then the inside lining with the flat of his hand. He missed the slim communicator sewn into the inner seam. A woman 2 cars back still had her phone up. Victoria caught the screen for a moment, between shoulders and cruiser lights. Mercer saw it late. He walked toward the lane and told an officer to clear the last waiting cars. By the time he turned back, the line had moved. Mason sealed the property bag and held it up for the third officer. The floodlight caught the plastic. Phone. Keys. Wallet. License. Registration. Mercer looked at Victoria. Talking back to an officer is a bad habit around here. Victoria stood where they had placed her. Her hands were secured. Her voice stayed even. Please state the charge clearly. Mercer gave it to Mason instead of to her. Obstruction. Mason repeated it for the arrest line. A cruiser door opened behind her. The main lane was almost empty now. Mercer handed the license to the third officer. The card went into the property bag with the rest of her things. The cruiser door shut behind Victoria. Mason took the front passenger seat. The third officer drove. Captain Mercer stayed at the checkpoint. Victoria sat upright in the back with her hands secured behind her. Her phone. Keys, wallet, license, and registration were already gone. The plastic property bag had left with the other car. Streetlights passed across the side window in short bands. No one in the front said much. The radio carried location updates. A unit number came through. Then the station name. Victoria kept her eyes on the glass and listened. Greenfield Station sat 3 turns off the main road. The patrol car rolled through the rear gate and stopped near a side entrance. Mason got out first. He opened the back door and stepped aside. "Watch your head." Victoria stepped down without using him for balance. Inside. The booking room was bright and cold. A camera stood against one wall. A fingerprint scanner sat beside a keyboard. The booking officer stayed on his stool and looked at the screen more than at her. Mason set the property bag on the counter. Obstruction at the checkpoint. The booking officer reached for the bag. He read the top tag once. Then he looked at Victoria. Name: Victoria Taylor. He typed it in. Address. She gave it to him. His hands paused over the keys when she said the street. Then he finished typing. Turn to your left. Victoria turned for the photo. The camera flashed. Face front. Another flash. Mason stood near the wall with his thumbs on his belt. The third officer leaned against the counter for a minute, then left. The booking officer opened the property bag and laid each item out in a row. Phone. Keys. Wallet. License. Registration. He slid the wallet open and checked the cards inside. One card made him stop. He pulled it free and held it closer to the light. Mason saw the motion. What is it? The booking officer turned the card toward him. Military identification. Dress photo. 4 stars. Mason took it from him and looked at it for a second too long. Then he gave a short laugh. People carry all kinds of things. He set it back on the counter. Victoria watched the card lie there between her wallet and keys. The booking officer looked at her again. Thumb on the scanner. She stepped up and pressed one thumb down. Then the other. A small black pad sat beside the scanner. He used it for the backup print card. When that part was done, he pointed toward a bench near the wall. Sit there until I finish the entry. Victoria sat. Her shoulders stayed straight. Her hands remained where they had been placed. Mason crossed the room and stopped by the water cooler. Captain Mercer came in through the side door a minute later. He still had his outer vest on. He looked at the counter first, then at Victoria. Booking done. Almost, the booking officer said. Mercer stepped over to the cooler. Mason handed him a cup. Their voices stayed low at first, then not low enough. Westfield, stop, Mercer asked. Mason nodded. Started with the usual speech. Mercer looked over once toward Victoria. Some folks hear one question and turn it into a hearing. Mason tipped the cup back. She kept asking for the reason on record. Mercer took a drink. Put that in the notes. Victoria said nothing. She kept her eyes on the counter. The military card was still there. The booking officer finished typing and looked up. One phone call after holding assignment. Victoria turned toward him. I'd like that call now. He pointed toward the wall phone. One call. Keep it short. Mason looked at Mercer. Mercer gave a small shrug. Let her call whoever she thinks is coming. Victoria stood and walked to the phone. Her hands were brought forward long enough for her to hold the receiver. She dialed from memory. The line picked up on the second ring. Operations. Victoria spoke in the same tone she had used at the checkpoint. Victoria Taylor. Authorization code Tango Delta 794. Protocol Oversight Delta. Greenfield Station. Processing complete. Property logged. The voice on the other end answered right away. Confirming identity. A pause followed. Victoria stood still with the receiver at her ear. Mason watched from the cooler. Mercer watched from the counter. The booking officer stopped typing again. The line came back. Identity confirmed. Response team en route. Estimated arrival. 43 minutes. Victoria answered once. Received. She hung up and turned back. Mercer pushed off the counter. That your lawyer? No. He waited for more. She gave him nothing. The booking officer cleared his throat and looked down at the screen again. A door opened from the hallway. Councilman Nolan Pierce walked in wearing a dark suit and no tie. He moved like he had been there before and did not need directions. Mercer straightened when he saw him. Pierce stopped at the counter and looked through the glass toward Victoria. "This the checkpoint arrest?" Mercer nodded. "Secondary lane refusal. Obstruction charge." Pierce glanced at the property laid out on the counter, then at Victoria. "Get her through holding tonight. We don't need this stop turning into a scene." Victoria stood by the phone and watched the three men without speaking. The booking officer picked up the military card again. Pierce noticed it. "What's that?" "Something from her wallet," Mason said. Pierce held out his hand. Mason passed it over. Pierce looked at the stars on the card, then at Victoria, then back at the card. He handed it to Mercer. "Put that with the rest." Mercer slid it back across the counter. The booking officer placed it beside the wallet and wrote one more line into the property sheet. Victoria was led toward the holding corridor a minute later. The door opened with a buzzer. She stepped through. A wall clock near the desk read 9:17. She looked at it once before the door closed behind her. The holding door opened again before Victoria had been inside long enough to sit. Mason Clark stood at the threshold. "Back out." Victoria stepped into the corridor. Her hands were secured in front now. Mason walked half a step behind her and guided her past the booking desk toward a smaller room off the side hall. Captain Mercer was already inside. The room held a metal table, 3 chairs, and a wall camera set high in one corner. Victoria took the chair facing the door. Mason stayed by the wall. Mercer laid the property sheet on the table and set the clear bag beside it. He opened the seal himself. Phone, keys, wallet, license, registration. The military card came out last. He held it between 2 fingers and looked at the front. The dress photo faced him. The stars sat at the collar line. Mercer picked up a pen from the table and tapped the card once near the edge. "Good, fake." Victoria kept her eyes on the card. "That identification is real." Mercer looked up. "Then tonight keeps getting stranger." He set the card down near the center of the table. Not back in the bag. Not with the wallet. Just alone where he could keep looking at it. Victoria spoke in the same tone she had used since the stop. "I asked for an attorney." Mercer sat down across from her. "You asked for a lot of things. I'm asking again." Mason shifted his weight by the wall. Mercer flipped the property sheet over and used the blank side like a scratch pad. He wrote her name once. Then the charge line. Then he stopped. "You people come through that checkpoint acting like every question is optional." Victoria watched his pen stay in his hand. "My address is not probable cause." Mercer leaned back a little. "This is not a courtroom. It became a record the minute you moved me to secondary." That made Mason look over. Mercer gave a short smile that did not stay on his face. "You like that word. It fits." He turned the military card over and checked the back. Ran the pen clip along the edge. Looked for the easy tell he expected to find. The buzzer sounded in the hall. A minute later, Nolan Pierce stepped into the room without waiting to be asked. He had taken his jacket off since the booking counter. His shirt sleeves were folded once. Mercer stood when he came in. Mason did the same. Pierce stayed near the end of the table and looked at Victoria first. Then, at the card in Mercer's hand. "Still on this." Mercer held it up. "She had this in her wallet." Pierce took it. His thumb passed over the photo. Then the stars. Then the seal. Victoria watched him read it without saying the rank out loud. Pierce set the card back down. "Add it to the file and keep the process moving." Victoria looked at him. "You came in fast for a routine booking." Pierce pulled a chair back with 2 fingers and sat at the corner of the table. "The checkpoint program reports up." "That's not an answer either." Pierce ignored that. He looked to Mercer. "Get the paper signed or finish the hold." Victoria turned her head toward Mercer. "I will not sign anything without counsel." Pierce rested his forearm on the table. "Then you can sit on it overnight." Mercer slid a single-page form across the metal surface. Obstruction line at the top. Signature block at the bottom. Victoria did not touch it. Mason stayed near the wall camera, with his hands low in front of him. The room went quiet for a few seconds. Then, the door opened again. A man in plain clothes stepped in with a folder under his arm. Detective Ethan Cole. He stopped just inside and looked from Mercer to Pierce to Victoria. Then his eyes went to the table. The military card got his attention before anything else did. Mercer turned toward him. What? Ethan stepped closer. Who logged that? Property from the checkpoint arrest, Mason said. Ethan set the folder down and picked up the card. He held it under the ceiling light, turned it once, checked the front, then the back. His thumb moved across the seal and the printed line near the bottom. Mercer watched him. Well, Ethan looked at Mercer. Not at Victoria. This isn't fake. Pierce stayed in his chair. You know that for sure. Ethan answered without changing tone. I've seen the real thing before. Mercer leaned one hand on the table. So she stole it. Ethan kept the card in hand. If you want that on paper, verify it first. Pierce looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at Mason. Nobody in the room wrote anything down. Victoria sat with her hand still on the table edge. That verification should have happened before booking. Mercer did not answer her. Ethan turned the card over once more. The light caught the seal again. He looked at the property sheet next. Then the charge line Mercer had started. Then the blank space still waiting for a signature. What was the original basis for secondary? Ethan asked. Mason spoke before Mercer could. Westfield address. Refusal to consent. Obstruction at the lane. Ethan let that sit where it was. Address is not basis. Pierce stood up. Detective. That part is handled. Ethan did not move. It's not handled if the card is real. Mercer reached out for it. Ethan did not hand it back right away. He looked once at Victoria, then to Mercer. You need to call this in. Pierce stepped around the chair. Not from this room. Ethan finally passed the card over. Mercer took it. But he did not put it back in the bag. The buzzer in the hall sounded again. A desk phone started ringing somewhere outside the door. Mason glanced toward the hallway. Pierce stayed where he was. Mercer kept the card in his hand. Victoria watched all three of them from her chair and said nothing. The phone kept ringing outside the room. Not once. More than once. Mercer still had the military card in his hand when the booking officer knocked and opened the door halfway. Captain, front desk needs you. Mercer looked at Pierce first, then at Ethan Cole, then back at the door. What is it? They're asking for Victoria Taylor by name. Victoria stayed in her chair. Her hands rested near the edge of the table. Pierce spoke before Mercer did. From who? The booking officer answered from the doorway. He said operations office. Federal line. Mercer stood up and stepped into the hall. The door stayed open long enough for Victoria to hear his shoes on the tile and the booking officer following behind him. Mason looked at Pierce. Pierce kept his eyes on Victoria. Ethan stayed where he was beside the table. The military card was gone from his hand now. Mercer had taken it with him. Pierce pulled the unsigned form closer and looked at the top line again. Obstruction still stands. Victoria looked at the paper. It stands on the same address line he used at the checkpoint. Pierce left that there. Mason shifted his feet by the wall. Ethan turned his head toward the hallway when another phone started ringing. A second line picked up right after it. The sound carried into the room. Mercer came back first. He had the card in one hand and his own phone in the other. His face looked tighter than it had at the checkpoint. Who did you call? Victoria answered him in the same tone she had used from the first stop. I made my one call. To who? You already heard enough of it. Pierce stood up. Captain. Mercer kept his eyes on Victoria. They asked for her by full name. Ethan spoke from the side of the table. That means verify now. Pierce looked at Mercer. Do it clean. Keep it inside. Mercer stepped back into the hall and this time left the door open. Victoria heard enough to follow the shape of it. Her name. The card number. A request for confirmation. Mercer stopped talking and listened. A few seconds passed. Then he gave a short answer. Understood. Mason looked toward the door and then back to Victoria. He had stopped talking. Stopped moving much, too. Ethan took the unsigned form from the table and set it off to one side. Pierce noticed. Leave that where it was. Ethan kept his hand on the page. If identity verifies, that form becomes a problem. Pierce answered, without raising his voice. It was already a problem when you walked in. Ethan let go of the paper. The desk phone rang again outside. The booking officer answered. This time his voice carried more clearly through the open door. Yes. Sir. She is here. He listened with the receiver tight to his ear. Then he straightened. Mercer came back into the room a second time. He closed the door behind him. The military card went onto the table in front of Pierce. He did not slide it back into the property bag. He left it face up. Identity confirmed, he said. The room held for a beat after that. Victoria looked at the card once, then at Mercer. Pierce stayed standing. Confirmed by who? Mercer answered him. Defense Operations Desk. Follow-up call coming from Command Liaison. Pierce put both hands on the table. We release her now. Miscommunication at the lane. Bad stop. Nothing more. Victoria spoke before Mercer could. That would leave the checkpoint logs where they are. Pierce turned to her. This room is not your command post. Ethan looked from one to the other, then at Mercer. The checkpoint logs need to be held. Pierce gave him a hard look. You're talking too much for someone who is not in charge of this room. Ethan did not step back. The body camera status needs to be held too. That brought Mason's eyes up from the floor. Mercer looked at him once. Then, back at Ethan. The door opened again before Pierce could answer. The booking officer stood there with a notepad in hand. Captain. Parking lot call. 3 black vehicles just turned in. Federal plates on one. The desk line says do not release property. Do not close intake. Preserve all recordings. Pierce moved first. He stepped into the hall and brushed past the booking officer. Mercer followed him. Mason stayed in the room for half a second and then went after them. Ethan stayed with Victoria. From the doorway they could hear the front desk now. Short voices. Steps moving faster. A buzz from the security door. Then the outside door opening. Victoria remained seated. Ethan reached for the cuff key, clipped behind his belt. Then stopped. Were you active at the checkpoint because of this program? Victoria looked at him. I drove through a public lane. That's not what I asked. It is the answer you're getting right now. Ethan nodded once. He understood enough to stop there. Footsteps came back down the hall. Mercer entered first. Pierce was right behind him. Neither man sat down this time. Mercer spoke to Mason without taking his eyes off Victoria. Bring the camera logs. Full shift. Pierce cut in. Not from this room. Mercer answered him without much room left in his voice. It's already out of this room. Ethan pulled the unsigned form farther away from the center of the table. Then he took the property sheet and set it on top of the clear bag. Mercer saw it and did not tell him to stop. Outside. Another car door shut. Then another. The booking officer appeared again. Captain. They're at the desk. Mercer looked at the military card on the table. Then at Victoria. Then toward the open hallway. The unsigned form stayed off to one side. The clear bag sat under the property sheet. No one brought up the charge line again. The booking officer stayed in the doorway. Captain. They're at the desk. Mercer picked up the military card. Pierce moved into the hall first. Mason followed. Ethan stayed with Victoria until the voices at the front desk got close enough to make out. A man spoke first. Command Liaison. We were told not to release property and not to close intake. Another voice gave a name from the station side. Then a second outside voice asked for the shift supervisor. Booking officer. And body camera log access. Victoria stayed in her chair. Her hands were still secured in front. Ethan looked toward the door. Then at her cuffs. I can clear those now, he said. Victoria looked at him. Your captain has not said that yet. He does not control this room the same way he did 20 minutes ago. Ethan took the key from his belt. He stepped behind her chair. The cuff on the left came free first, then the right. Victoria brought her hands forward and set them on the table. She rubbed one wrist once and stopped. Ethan put the cuffs on the far end of the table and left the key beside them. The hallway filled with more footsteps. Mercer came back in with 2 men and 1 woman behind him. The first man wore a dark field jacket over a pressed shirt. The second had a government badge clipped at his belt. The woman carried a hard case and a yellow evidence seal roll in one hand. Mercer stayed by the door. He did not sit. The man in the field jacket looked at Victoria first, then at the open property bag, then at the unsigned form Ethan had moved off to the side. Victoria Taylor. Victoria stood. Yes. The man gave a short nod. Daniel Brooks. Defense liaison. He did not reach for her. He did not offer a speech. He looked at the cuffs on the table, then at Ethan. Who removed those? I did. Ethan said. Good. The woman with the case stepped to the table and opened it. Inside were seal strips, storage sleeves, and a small camera. She photographed the military card where Mercer had left it, then the property bag, then the unsigned form, then the property sheet on top of the bag. The second man stepped closer to Mercer. Who had control of intake from the checkpoint stop to this room? Mercer answered him. I did. Who ordered secondary? Officer Clark initiated it. On what basis? Mercer looked past him for half a second, then back. Further screening. The man waited. Mercer did not add more. Ethan spoke from the side of the table. The address line triggered secondary. Pierce had reached the doorway by then. He came in without being asked and stopped beside Mercer. This room is still part of a local station. Daniel Brooks looked at him. State your name for the record. Nolan Pierce. City Council. Brooks took that in without changing tone. Then you are here as a witness. Not as command. Pierce did not sit either. The woman with the case sealed the military card into a clear sleeve and marked the time on the tab. Then she looked at Victoria. Do you want your phone returned now or held until the intake copy is complete? Hold it until the copy is complete. She answered right away. Ethan looked at her once when she said that. He understood what it meant. Keep the chain clean. The second man at Mercer's shoulder asked for the body camera log. Mason had appeared in the doorway again. Mercer looked at him. Bring the log. Mason left without a word. Brooks nodded toward the chair. General. You can sit if you want. Victoria sat. Her hand stayed on the table. Pierce looked at Brooks. General. Brooks turned to him. The identification was confirmed before we entered the lot. Pierce did not answer that. The booking officer brought in a printed intake sheet and a second sheet with timestamps from the checkpoint unit list. The woman from Brooks's team photographed both before touching them. Then she sealed each page in separate sleeves. Ethan bent, picked up the folder he had carried earlier, and placed it on the table beside the property bag. These are internal checkpoint schedules, shift emails, and complaint notes that never made it through final entry. Mercer looked at him. You took files out of the system. Ethan answered, without changing tone. I made copies after entries stopped disappearing on their own. Brooks opened the folder. The top page showed checkpoint locations by date. Westfield Heights appeared again and again in the same column. The next page had short email lines. Target secondary from westbound evening flow. Higher yield from Westfield exits. Keep side lane staffed until final pass. Brooks read the first 2 pages. Then he closed the folder halfway and asked the woman with the case to photograph those too. Pierce stepped closer to the table. Those are incomplete work notes. Victoria spoke before Brooks did. Then the full server image will settle that. Brooks gave a short nod. It will. Mason came back with a printed camera status log and 1 tablet from the equipment room. He handed both to the second man. The man checked the log, then the tablet, then the timestamps. Officer Clark's camera drops off during contact. Mason stood still. Mercer looked at the tablet and said nothing. Brooks pulled the unsigned obstruction form closer with 1 finger. Who prepared this? Mercer answered him. I did. Brooks looked at the blank signature line, then at Victoria, then back at Mercer. It stays. The woman sealed that form next. Ethan moved the cuffs farther away from the center of the table. The front desk phone rang again somewhere out in the hall. This time nobody in the room turned toward it. Daniel Brooks stayed in the room long enough to watch the first set of seals go on. Then he stepped into the hall with the second man from his team and the booking officer. Their voices stayed low. A few minutes later, the booking officer came back with a cart. A desktop tower sat on the lower shelf. 2 evidence boxes sat on top. The woman from Brooks's team cleared a section of table and opened the first box. Drive sleeves. Seal tabs. Chain sheets. She looked at Mercer. We are holding intake records. Checkpoint logs. Body camera status. Side lane assignments. And property handling from first contact forward. Mercer stood by the door and listened. Pierce stayed a little farther back now. He had stopped stepping into the center of the room. Mason stayed near the wall with his hands low and his eyes on the table. Ethan Cole stood beside Victoria. Not close, just on the same side of the room. The second man from Brooks's team rolled the desktop tower out of the booking office himself. He set it on the cart and checked the asset tag. Then he wrote the number down and photographed the back panel before unplugging anything else. The booking officer brought over the checkpoint sign-out sheet next. Then the lane staffing sheet. Then the unit list from that evening. Each page went into its own sleeve. Each sleeve got a time mark. Victoria watched the stack grow. The unsigned obstruction form stayed near the edge of the table under its own seal. The charge line was still visible through the plastic. Brooks came back in and looked at Ethan's folder again. Where did these copies come from? Shift printer and archive pull. Ethan said. Dates. 6 months back. Brooks opened to the checkpoint map and laid it flat. The same neighborhood showed up again and again in the side lane pattern. Westfield Heights on weeknights. Westfield Heights on weekend evenings. Westfield Heights near school dismissal. Westfield Heights after church let out on Sunday. Pierce saw the pages from where he stood. That is traffic planning. Victoria answered before Brooks did. Then the full review should match it. Brooks kept the folder open. It will either match or it will not. That part is simple. He turned to the second man from his team. Hold the server room. No overwrite cycle. The man nodded and left the room. Mason looked at Mercer when he heard that. Mercer did not look back. The room kept narrowing around the paperwork. The local station still stood where it had been an hour earlier, but the work in it had changed. The booking officer brought in one more sheet. The overnight roster. Names by shift. Assignments by lane. Brooks read down the page once. Then he took out a pen and marked 2 lines near the middle. Captain Grant Mercer. Officer Mason Clark. He did not say anything while he marked them. He passed the sheet to the woman with the case. She made a copy at the booking machine and clipped it to a new chain sheet. Pierce finally spoke again. What exactly are you doing with that roster? Brooks looked up. Freezing tonight's assignment record. Pierce folded his arms. This is still a local department. Brooks answered in the same tone he had used from the start. Then local records should stay available. Nobody argued with that. A call came through from the front desk a few minutes later. The booking officer took it in the hall and came back with a short message. City manager's office is asking whether checkpoint operations continue tomorrow morning. Brooks looked at Pierce. Pierce did not answer right away. Victoria sat with both hands on the table and watched him. Brooks spoke to the booking officer instead. Tell them the checkpoint program is paused pending record review. That line went into the desk log before anyone in the room moved on. The booking officer wrote it by hand. Then he typed the same instruction into the station system. Victoria saw the screen from across the room. Checkpoint status changed from active to hold. Start time for morning deployment disappeared from the next shift view. A second notice sat below the hold entry. Prior secondary lane arrests tied to the program were moved to review status. A retention number was added to the desk log after that. Side lane video from the checkpoint could not clear on the next cycle. 3 older report numbers from prior Westfield secondary stops were printed from archive and clipped to the new review sheet before midnight. A request to hold the city ordnance file tied to the checkpoint program was entered into the same log before the desk moved on. A second screen opened after that. Access control. Lane camera archive. Body camera sync. Property intake edit rights. The woman with the case read off names. The booking officer entered them one at a time. Grant Mercer. Mason Clark. 2 other officers from the lane. Each line changed from active to restricted, pending review. No speeches came with it. No raised voices either. Just the screen changing. 1 line at a time. Ethan set his folder flat on the table again. Brooks looked at him. "You understand this will place you inside the record?" Ethan nodded. "I'm already inside it." Brooks gave him a witness form. Ethan read the first page, standing up. Then he signed at the bottom and wrote the time beside his name. Victoria looked at the form long enough to see the title. Internal Witness Intake. That was the first clean line of the night that did not need explaining. The woman with the case returned Victoria's phone. Keys. And wallet after the inventory copy was complete. Her license and registration followed. The military card came last. It was handed back in its sleeve. Victoria checked the front once, then the back, then placed it in the wallet without comment. Brooks looked at Mercer. Her property is released. The hold room entry stays. The intake record stays. The checkpoint file stays. Mercer gave one short nod. That was all he had left to give. By the time Victoria stepped out of the interview room, the station had a different board at the desk than the one she had entered through. The checkpoint unit board was blank. The morning lane assignments were gone. A printed notice sat beside the keyboard. Program paused pending external review. A second printed sheet sat under it. Case review queue opened for prior secondary lane stops. She saw Ethan at the far end of the counter signing his second form. Mason was not in the hall anymore. Pierce had moved to an office with the door shut. Mercer stood alone by the booking desk while the server cart was wheeled past him toward evidence storage. Victoria stopped long enough to look at the roster copy one last time. 2 names had already been lifted from the next shift line. The deployment monitor refreshed once. Those 2 names did not return. That was where the road ended. Not at the checkpoint. Not in the interview room. On a roster. On an access screen. On a paused program with the records held in sealed sleeves. Some stops end on the roadside. This one ended in the system that backed the roadside up. That is the part worth paying attention to. Drop your take in the comments. Share this story with somebody who has seen a stop change after one look at an address. Subscribe to Black Tales Exposed for more stories where the record stays put and the paper trail does the talking.